Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 18 composers who were masters of large forms. Large forms being anything multi-movement, multi-sectional, but unified in some way. I mean, it can be a symphony, but that's later. I mean, we're talking also about operas and all kinds of stuff. And really, it's an interesting list, I think. All the usual characters are here. I know that. I know. So some of you are going to be bored and say, oh, it's just going to be like Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart. And those. Well, yes, it will be. But there are also some very interesting other folks here that I think deserve mention. And there are 18 of them because I'm indulging in a little bit of gematria in this series. We're doing masters of large forms and miniaturists, both. And there are going to be 18 of each. 18, if you know your gematria. Gematria is a Hebrew numerology in the Bible, finding meaning in the numerical values of certain specific words, because in Hebrew, the alphabet is also counting. It's also numbers. All the alphabetical letters have a numerical value. So when you see these things, well, 18 is a magic number in gematria. Why? Because the Hebrew word for life is chai, and that consists of two letters, a chet and a yud. And if you know your Hebrew alphabet, you've got aleph, beis, gimel, daled, hey, vav, zayin, chet, 8, tet, yud, 10. 8 plus 10, add them up, you get 18. It's the number of life. And so I'm doing 18 masters of large forms because these forms are living creatures. And God said so. Sort of. Anyway, let's get to the list, shall we? Vivaldi. That may be a surprise to some of you. Vivaldi, is not thought of as a master of form, but Vivaldi's 4,000 billion concertos are really quite extraordinary because he, as Bach knew, by the way, he codified the three-movement concerto. And three-movement concerto form is with us still. I mean, and it sort of began with Vivaldi. I mean, he's contemporaries too, but he was, one of the very best at it. And he did all kinds of three-movement forms and things, there's just an infinite variety with which he arranged those three movements. Now, most of these concerti are not long by large form standards of the late Romantic period, right? Because if a Vivaldi concerto lasts 10 minutes, that's a big deal. But in those days, that was a large instrumental form. Instrumental music consisted of little tiny dance sniglets for the most part, and that was it. Everything else was vocal and songs and arias and things which could be considerably longer, or little overtures and sinfonias. The length of the work was small, but the fact that you could have these abstract instrumental multi-movement compositions in the late 1600s and early 1700s was a big deal. And so Vivaldi is, I think, our first master of large forms. You could add Corelli, who sort of did the concerto grosso thing. But you could throw him in there too as a precursor. But Vivaldi, I think, is a good place to start because we still have his concerto form, whereas Corelli's concerto grossi things sort of came and went. So Vivaldi, definitely. And as I mentioned, J.S. Bach, because he learned a lot from Vivaldi. Transcribing Vivaldi, Bach took the three-movement concerto and ran with it, inventing with his son CPE the keyboard concerto and enlarging its size and range because Bach was nothing if not fond of many, many notes. And he wrote fantastic, we know the Bach concerti, we don't have to talk about it, but also Bach was a master at large forms in pieces like the B minor Mass and the St. Matthew Passion and St. John Passion and his variation sets. So that he wrote big musical pieces. Think about the chaconne from the D minor partita for violin. 15-minute work for solo violin. It's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. Bach had a vast command of musical scale and timing. Because you got to know when to quit. You're not a master of large form if your timing is off. Lots of composers had timing that was slightly off, however wonderful they were at other things. Handel was a composer who was almost totally free form, but who was a master of timing. And because he was a master of timing, he was a master of form, particularly in his operas. Opera seria, a medium which for 200 years was thought to be hopelessly obsolete and untheatrical. Handel proved it wrong. His operas are thrilling when staged sympathetically. His oratorios, whoa! He could arrange choral masses like architecture. I mean, just a stunning, astounding ability to put together large groups of pieces, even if you can't give them a formal name, for the process. Handel is definitely one of the biggies. So is Mozart. Not so much for the symphonies, certainly for his chamber music. I mean, the quintets and quartets are astounding. The grand partita, that fabulous E-flat string trio, which is like 50 minutes long and amazing. It doesn't have a single note out of place. But Mozart also applied his incredible sense of form to opera, to these amazing operatic finales where the music gets going and can go for 20 minutes without a break. And it's perfectly shaped and balanced. And his invention of the classical piano concerto and concerto form, based on Vivaldi's concerto form, but adapted to the needs of the sonata style. One of the most subtle and brilliant uses of the sonata style in all of instrumental music. I mean, Mozart was amazing when it came to form. He had the sense of proportion. So did Beethoven, believe it or not. Yes, Beethoven was of course, revolutionary in everything that he did. And his late works are particularly interesting because his late works are almost about musical forms. They're music about music, especially the piano sonatas and the quartets, where he's always alternating contrapuntal forms or, rhetorical forms, such as, fugues or variations, with sonata form type things. And there's this ongoing tension between the kind of music that the work wants to be and the synthesis of the two different types of writing to create new and large, very large forms. So Beethoven is on the list. It's one thing to just sort of make a list. It's another thing to try and explain why somebody's on the list. You know what I mean? So that's what I'm trying to get at here, to give a sense of, it's not just because history has said they're major composers and they were masters of form. It's because of what they actually did. They had special approaches to form. Here's a name that you probably wouldn't have thought of, Rossini. Rossini is one of the great classical composers. He was also one of the great romantic composers, which is he's really an amazing, amazing composer. He doesn't get anything like the attention and credit he deserves. He went from being a master of large forms to being a master of small forms. So we may see him on both lists. But Rossini codified the forms of Italian opera. And Italian opera, especially the bel canto tradition in the 19th century, had very, very specific, some would say rigid, formulae for how these operas were put together. The basic unit was the scena. And what was a scena? Well, you have a recitative, and then you'd have a slow aria expressing feeling. Then there would be an interruption of some sort where, the maid would come in and say, oh, the sheets are missing, or everyone would scream consternation. And then the energy would build up and it would be released in the cabaletta, the quick conclusion of the whole thing. And these scenas could last anywhere from, not very long to half an hour. I mean, they could be really big and really long. And Rossini was astounding at creating large forms out of what one would think was simply, individual sectional little movements. But it was like creating a symphony. You had individual movements, and they form a complex and coherent whole. And Rossini invented that effectively, he was the model for everything that came after, all the way up through Puccini. Really an astounding talent and a formal genius. a classical formal genius on the level of Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven and those folks. And it's really time he got recognized as such. He's not because he was Italian and because he didn't write symphonies, but he wrote for what he did in his operas. They were formal masterpieces. So Rossini, Brahms, of course. Well, we have to do Brahms. Do I need to talk about Brahms? No. Brahms was, everybody admits that Brahms was amazing, and Brahms was. It was something that mattered tremendously to him. He was operating in the footsteps of the great classical masters by self-conscious design, and he was up to the challenge. So that's all we need to say there. Dvořák. Dvořák is a very interesting case. Very interesting. Because Dvořák was neither a Brahmsian classicist nor a Wagnerian radical. He was both simultaneously. And he was good at both. And he was operating within, trying to create the Czech version of those things as a romantic nationalist. And he succeeded. He succeeded amazingly well. But it really is extraordinary how able he was doing both large theatrical forms, his operas and oratorios and things, and classical forms in instrumental music. And then, of course, there were the pieces that were sui generis, his tone poems and other things. I mean, he was, and, he learned how to become a master of form. Earlier in his career, he had some timing issues, let's put it that way. But he learned. He conquered his difficulties. After Dvořák, I'd say, I have to talk about Nielsen. Nielsen, who was really the great Beethoven composer after Beethoven. Music of struggle, of goal-directed, intense movement toward a destination, tonally. He was remarkable. His music has no dead spots at all. He had a fabulous sense of timing. Really remarkable. I mean, one of the great musical dramatists, and he deserves credit for that. People don't give him that much attention, but he should have it. Fauré. Fauré is one of the great chamber music composers of the 19th century. He was not interested so much in orchestral music, but he was interested in music in large forms. And he had his very own personal harmonic style, which allowed him to create extraordinarily sensitive and emotionally rich pieces that sound like nothing else. It's a subtle style. It's not the kind of thing that you're going to hear it and go, it's a grandiose, fabulous, big, noisy peroration. That wasn't his style at all. He was subtle, he was intimate, but he had the vision. He really did. And his, the piano quartets, the violin sonatas, his pieces, they're magnificent, absolutely magnificent, and like nothing else. And sometimes a little difficult to first wrap your brain around. But he certainly understood large forms and was confident in working it within them. Smetana, you might not think, right? But Smetana was really important because Smetana was able to do what Liszt wanted to do, which is write big tone poems on, single subjects, but that actually make sense, that aren't too long, that don't, even before he did Ma Vlast, his Wallenstein trilogy and things like. He was really, really good at writing this programmatic music, as well as operas. I mean, let's not forget his operas are absolutely marvelous and dreadfully underrated, because most people just don't know anything after The Bartered Bride. I mean, a few people know Dalibor or something like that, but no, he was a really gifted formal master. You can hear that very clearly in his chamber music, in the two-string quartets, in the cello sonata, things like that. He was really, really gifted at writing in large forms, and he gets very little credit for it. And it's very interesting because, like I said, he's generally seen as a sort of, Liszt epigon, but no, he wasn't. You can play all of Ma Vlast, all 6 tone poems in it, and it's not boring. Okay, Tabor and Blahnik, well, maybe they get a little bit, long in the tooth toward the end there. But basically, it's an extraordinary work and very cohesive. So give the man a little credit. Elgar. Elgar was well, everybody knows who Elgar was. I mean, he's the English composer to end all English composers in some ways. But, pieces like the Enigma Variations, his concert overtures, the two symphonies are all beautifully, beautifully crafted and very well timed. I mean, he doesn't have dead spots, really, I think, in any of that stuff. And there are some other works, like the Introduction at Allegro, which is stunning. Beautiful free-form composition. He had a real feeling for form. Even earlier, when he was writing, oratorio things like the Black Knight or Caractacus or all that stuff, he always knew when to get on with it. I think I don't find those pieces at all dull. I really don't. They may be a little conservative and a little bit stuck in that choral tradition that people deride now. I don't think it deserves derision. I mean, bad music deserves derision, but his music was not bad music, not a bit. And he was a symphonist to the manner born. It's a pity he didn't write more. I mean, I think his violin concerto is the most astonishing example of what a master he was, because it has huge outer movements, particularly the finale, but it manages to be pretty gripping all the way throughout, 50 minutes long or something. It's crazy, but yeah, it works. He knew what he was about. Wagner. Of course, Wagner was a master of the largest forms. I mean, let's face it, Das Rheingold begins with an E-flat major chord and Götterdämmerung ends with an E-flat major chord. What happens in the middle? Well, that's anybody's guess, but that's a big form. You know where you're going to end when you know where you're starting, and it's 15 hours later, you're coming home to roost at E-flat major. Well, that's a large form. The extent to which Wagner mastered that form, well, I don't think there's any question about that, is there? He really did. I mean, his music does have dead spots. I mean, he did have some timing issues because he was not equally great as he thought at everything he did. In other words, he wasn't as great a poet as he was a composer, and, his unwillingness to jettison a few thousand extra words from his librettos made his operas very long, but he did adapt to that time scale. And I was always amazed in the theater by just how quick the music seemed to go. My first performance, live performance of Tristan and Isolde, I couldn't get my brain around it on recordings. I just couldn't. I just thought it was boring beyond belief. Even Wagner says, nothing happens for 4 hours, So he understood. But in the theater, wow. I mean, the music just grabs you and it doesn't let go, no matter how long-winded it is. Okay, King Mark's soliloquy in Act 2 when he catches them, making nookie. Okay, that could be, limited. But boy, oh boy, it moves. It works. It just works. He understood, how to proportion his forms. So, yeah, absolutely an amazing formal genius. Mahler. Oh, Mahler was controversial. It took such a long time before people figured out what he was about in terms of form. But Mahler was a formal genius. He really was, even though his symphonies seem to be put together from various sources and, in lots of different movements and songs and things stuffed in them. They're miracles of timing. They really are. One of the things Mahler made a real contribution to was the history of first movement sonata form. People don't give him any credit for it. They don't realize it. But what Mahler did to enlarge sonata form to meet the scale of what his vision was introduce the second subject of his sonata form movements preludially, and then go back to his first subject and extend that. So you have almost a double exposition, and it worked really, really, really well. I mean, an example of it is the first movement of the Second Symphony, right? You have the big climax, cha ta ta cha ta, right at the beginning. Bum, pwa, do, do, do. Then you hear the anticipation of the second subject, ya da 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 da, and then it finds its way back to the first subject, and you get the real first subject, the whole long thing. And it finally comes to rest, 6 minutes later, and we have the full version of the second subject. That also happens in the Third Symphony, where you have, all that gnarly funeral marchy stuff, da 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 da, right? And then it all settles down, and you have the first glimmerings of life with the trills, ja, 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 the oboe tune, ja, da 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 da, but just a bit, right? And then it goes back to the beginning, and then you've got the big trombone solo and all that stuff. It's an expansion of sonata form, and it works really, really well. And that was sort of a Mahler invention. He uses it all the time. First movement of the seventh does it. It's very, very effective. So Mahler was definitely a master of form and proportion. And the better you know his music, the more you begin to realize that. You just have to understand the scale on which it operates. That's really what it boils down to. But once you get it, that's what it is. Shostakovich, another great symphonist who never used the same form exactly twice in his symphonies. They're extraordinarily individual organisms, each one, and they all have different forms and arrangements of movements, and they work fabulously well. A very, very exciting and intense composer, as you know, emotionally gripping. Some of his movements have some dead spots, but that doesn't change the overall sense. Even in the 12th Symphony, the much maligned 12th Symphony, I mean, it's exciting as all hell. I mean, it really, really moves. And if the finale is unconvincing expressively, which I think it is, it still has, it's not too long. And, it's nice and vulgar at the end. You get your, enough of a bang for your buck. So after Shostakovich, César Franck, a brilliant master of form, fabulous. I mean, listen, he's the guy who invented the whole Franck school of symphonic composition, of cyclical form. And in his symphony and in his late chamber works, the string quartet, the piano quintet, and the violin sonata, his 3 organ chorales, the late works are just amazing pieces of formal accuracy. The symphonic variations, he was an amazing variation writer. He really, really understood his form and his proportions. And he's another composer who doesn't get much attention for that reason, because he's French, and because people think that cyclical form is kind of a cheap, it's kind of a cheap way out. Let's just repeat the themes from the last movement in the finale, and there we have form. Well, there's more to it than that. There really is, and Franck was tremendous, and of course his successors, Dandy and Magnard and Roussel and all these composers, all the Portuguese composers that we've been enjoying, Braga Santos and Freitas Branco and all they all were Franckians. They wrote in that school of writing, and it works very, very well. It's very successful. So you got to give the man some props. Sibelius. Oh, wow. Sibelius is one of the great masters of form, and he invented them as he went. There's really no way to explain what Sibelius did. He began as a Tchaikovsky Liszt sonata form guy in like the first symphony, and then he started enlarging the concept of form as these organic sort of globules that build up from thematic fragments to a big climax and then refragment, and then merging movements together into sort of larger wholes and creating this unbelievable flow. And in fact, he was so good at flow that he sometimes didn't quite know how to end. Sibelius' problem was coming up with endings always, because he would achieve so much motion and movement and sort of happeningness that he didn't always know how to stop it. But oh my goodness, was he a formal genius? The 5th Symphony and the 7th, and it's great stuff. So Sibelius, and last but not least, of course, Haydn has to be there, the greatest of all. He invented music as we know it, plain and simple. If it weren't for Haydn, we would not have the forms of instrumental music that all of these other people were working on. All of them. He really did it, and he did it basically single-handedly. I mean, there are no composers who were contemporaries of Haydn who were anything like as adventurous and forward-thinking, until you get to Mozart and Beethoven, who were forward-thinking in their own way based on what they took from Haydn. So music begins with Haydn. Not all music. There was Baroque music, obviously. Haydn also had to start somewhere. But boy, did he take the ball and run with it. He was just the most developmental composer that ever lived, with an impeccable sense of timing. His use of silence, his handling of large forms and allowing things to build up and conclude with effortless inevitability. Yeah, and he did it on small scales and large scales. He did it in his late masses and the oratorios. I mean, he was the guy. Ooh, he was the bomb, as they say in the biz. So there you have it. 18 masters of large forms, all of whom mastered large forms in their own way. But what they all have in common is that feeling for proportion and that unerring sense of timing. Because without that, none of the rest matters. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.